Hello friends, today we are going to learn what is WSL and the underlying architecture of WSL and the key differences between WSL1 and WSL2. So let's dive in. What is WSL? WSL stands for Windows Subsystem for Linux. So with the help of WSL you can actually run Linux on Windows. Isn't this something cool? So you can run command line tools, utilities, applications directly on Windows unmodified without the overhead of a traditional VM or dual boot setup. So you can run bash shell scripts and some common command line tools such as grep, sed, awk, and you can choose your own Linux distribution like Ubuntu, Debian, Alpine, and others. Also, you can install additional software using own GNU Linux distribution package manager and much more things to do. So actually WSL is a lightweight virtual machine that actually has original Linux kernel. So it is not some fancy and heavy VM running on your Windows, but it's a lightweight utility VM where it has the actual Linux kernel that is built by Microsoft on it. So let's go through the underlying architecture behind WSL1. So I will go through the key differences later, like the difference between WSL1 and WSL2, why WSL2 is faster than WSL1. So we'll go through those details later, but first let's understand the architecture behind WSL1. So WSL1 actually takes the translation-based approach. Basically, it has a translation layer. So first we have these Linux user space binaries. So you get those binaries when you get a Linux distribution, like I mentioned earlier. So you can choose whatever Linux distribution you want with WSL. So it can be Ubuntu or Debian or Alpine. So once you have that Linux distribution installed, so you can get those Linux user space libraries. So these Linux user space libraries basically talk to translation layer in WSL. So when you issue like a system-based call, like accessing memory or files or network, so they call to the translation layer. So those are the actual Linux commands that gets as an input to the translation layer. So the translation layer actually takes these Linux commands and converts them into Windows system calls. So once you get those Windows system calls, they get passed up to the Windows NT kernel. So where the Windows NT kernel responds to the system calls from the translation layer, and then it gives the response back to the translation layer. So if you see here, it's all Windows commands here. So once it gets back to the translation layer, so it actually converts those Windows commands back to Linux commands so that the system can understand the Linux commands. So at the end of the day, we have the application binary interface for Linux. So let's understand how WSL2 works. So WSL2 actually takes the virtualization based approach rather than the translation based approach. So we don't have any translation layer here. So it actually runs a lightweight utility virtual machine on top of the Windows hypervisor layer. So that lightweight utility machine like quickly boots up under a second, and it has our Linux user space boundaries that comes with the Linux distribution, and a small Linux kernel that is built by Microsoft and maintained by Microsoft. So whenever now you make a system call like accessing memory or accessing a file, so those Linux commands get actually passed to the Linux kernel, and then the Linux kernel responds back the response with the necessary file or the memory. So if you see everything here under the layer uh, has like Linux commands. So there's no translation overhead here. So that means you can avoid all the translation layer, which leads to 100% system call compatibility and faster I/O performance. Thanks for watching.